Hey there, friends. I want to put out a quick weekend video for you guys to show some of the corruptness of our government. Not that anybody that watches any of my videos needs any kind of history on how corrupt our government is or the politicians associated with it, but I wanted to detail at a high level somewhat of the money trail that's happening right now, more specifically regarding the FTX collapse. FTX, as you guys may or may not know, is a cryptocurrency company, one of the larger cryptocurrency exchanges out there, that has pretty much collapsed based on corruption, mismanagement of funds. They've essentially created a kind of a quasi-Ponzi scheme where they've taken investors' money, and instead of leaving it there and allowing it to continue to stay in there as accessible money, they've stolen that money with the hopes, the fingers crossed hopes, that the people don't ask for it back anytime soon, because they're taking that money and investing it into other things that they're hoping they would get a return on, so they can hurry and put that money back before the people ask for their money back who initially invested into FTX. As news came out that FTX was mismanaging some money, some things kind of started to leak out. People started asking for their money back sooner than FTX had counted on. So they didn't have money to pay back because they had already invested it into other areas that they were not supposed to. Again, they were taking your money if you invested in the FTX and taking the risk to put it into something else, hoping they would get a reward and a return, and you wouldn't notice. Well, people noticed. The interesting thing about it is FTX is tied deeply and directly in with the Democratic National Committee and, you got it, Ukraine. So essentially what has been happening is the federal government, United States federal government, has been stealing or taking, however you want to call it, taxpayer dollars from tax-paying Americans. Now, we're talking about the working class people who sit on their butts and don't do anything or not contributing into the system. I want to make that very clear. Just because you pay sales taxes doesn't mean you pay any of the money that's actually going overseas to the Ukraine. People who work, get up in the morning, tie their work boots on, and go to work every morning, that's the people who the federal government has built out of their money, in the tune of 60 billion or whatever the number is. I've lost track of that number a long time ago. But they've taken all this money to send to Ukraine for aid and arms. Now, aid and arms, think about this. What are we talking about with aid and arms? We want, of course, they're going to be supposedly buying weapons with it to defend themselves. Supposedly they're going to be providing infrastructure, maybe soft infrastructure or heavy infrastructure, for any buildings that might be torn apart or whatever. It's not our responsibility. Somehow or another, we're on the hook for that. I don't know how that happens. But that money is intended to go over there to help the people of Ukraine either rebuild, protect themselves, or sustain life during this war with Russia. Ukraine is receiving our taxpayer dollars from our corrupt federal government, taking that money and not buying aid with it and not buying arms with it. Some they are, yes, of course. FTX is not a aid or arms company. None of that money, zero of that money, was intended to be invested as an investment by the Ukraine government. That's not what it was sent there for. I don't think any of the American people knew that. Had Joe Biden stood up in front of the American people and said, I'm going to send your taxpayer dollars to Ukraine so that they can invest that into some kind of investment in hopes that they make some money. Well, why don't we just give that back to the American people? Let us invest that into something. Why are we sending it overseas to allow them to potentially make a profit? How come you don't take those billions of dollars and just distribute it to all the American people and let us take our chances and roll that dice to see if we can make a little bit of money? Let's turn a profit over here instead of allowing Ukraine to do that. What you're having is essentially a money laundering scheme. You're having the taxpayer money taken from the taxpayers of the United States. Our government, in turn, gives that to Ukraine. Ukraine decides to invest that into FTX, which initially takes that money at the end of the day, brings that over to Democratic National Campaign committees. Those committees are propping up Democrat candidates in hopes that they end up winning. So now they have more Democrat candidates in Congress to again talk the federal government into sending more money back over to Ukraine. And it just starts that vicious cycle over and over and over again. To give you a general example of what the leader of FTX, and I'm not going to say his name because I consider him somewhat like a rampage killer or mass shooter would be, so I'm not going to give him the notoriety. but he has committed $100 million of his money to Democrats in 2024 to run during that election season. Of course, that's going to include presidency. He said, though, that if Donald Trump were to enter the race, which this news report came out before Trump announced that he was going to be in the race, he actually said if Trump entered the race, instead of $100 million, he was going to put upwards to $1 billion of his money into that race. Well, that's not going to happen now because he doesn't have that kind of money. But that's what his commitment was. That's how staunchly he was looking at getting Democrats into full power. Now, how does this affect the gun community? Well, obviously, the more people you put in there that are going to vote for Democrat, you have guaranteed votes against the Second Amendment. With Republicans, you have kind of 50-50 votes. You have a bunch of rhinos in there and a bunch of cowards who may or may not vote for anti-gun bills. When you have a Democrat, you know they're voting for an anti-gun bill. So he's guaranteeing the existence and the potential passage of anti-gun bills by guaranteeing that Democrats are going to be elected by being part of that money laundering scheme that the federal government, Ukraine, and FTX and the DNC are involved in. Now, how does this also indirectly affect the gun community in another way totally? Well, think of it this way. All that money that FTX stole from their customers and lost on the market, and their own investments, poor investments, bad decisions, things like that. All that money that they lost, there are people that don't have that money. There are people that when somebody says, I'm worth this much money, in many cases, they take into account what their portfolio is. In other words, what they have invested in, even though they've given money to, say, a company like FTX. Let's say they gave, and I'm using this because I certainly don't have this kind of money. Let's say they gave $100,000 to FTX. So that person is worth at least $100,000 on paper, right? Because they had that investment in FTX. If FTX loses all that money, that person is now worth zero according to their investments. So there are people that are worth zero right now, at least in terms of what they put into FTX, because they're not going to get that money back. So if somebody received money from FTX, shouldn't they pay it back? Because there are tax-paying Americans who actually were responsible for the origination of that money. In other words, they earned that money themselves and they elected to give it to FTX. Well, now you have one of our favorite anti-gun groups out there, Everytown For Gun Safety, who also received a lot of money from FTX. So they received squandered and bilked money that was stolen from investors who invested into FTX. FTX took that money and gave it over to Everytown. Maybe Everytown should pay those people. I think there should be a fund created to pay those people back. All these people who received millions of dollars, including the DNC, should be made to release that money because it was stolen. If you and I are in possession of stolen money, do you think the federal government will allow us to keep it? No, they'll keep it. They'll confiscate it for evidence, and they'll end up keeping it themselves at the end of the day. So they're not going to let us keep stolen money. So why should they be allowed to keep stolen money? Everytown For Gun Safety is in possession of stolen funds right now, and I'd like to know what their intent is to get rid of it or what they're going to do with it.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America. It's over.